Is talking money difficult? You're darn right it is. How about talking money with your loved ones? How about when you're in a relationship? The notion that men are the sole breadwinners is a thing of the distant past. In fact, 41% of moms are the sole or primary breadwinners in American families. So we have got to be able to discuss finances, debt, and personal finance goals. We sat down with personal finance expert Farnoosh Torabi on how she manages this very topic in her home and her advice for others. Farnoosh, you have written a lot about couples, women who make more money than their partners. Is the real issue a social or cultural issue?
I'm a female breadwinner in my marriage. It's a growing number of women in this country who are out earning their spouses. It's something that we need to cheer. But unfortunately, there are a lot of headwinds facing relationships where there is a female who is out earning her husband.
Is the issue, what's the definition of normal? It was normal for my grandmother not to be able to get a credit card in her name. And the opportunities that my daughter will have are greater than what I had.
Yes.
So is the issue how we define normal?
Normal is ever expanding and ever changing and ever evolving. So there's normal, but there's also what's reality too. What the reality is that we have these trends. We have more women going to college. I think that's exciting. We have more women who are excited about managing the money in their relationships, going out there and being entrepreneurs and getting the raise. And, we need to respect everybody's sort of the lens through which they look at the world, but we also can't ignore some of these statistics and where we are today.
So money makes the world go round, yet it's still so difficult for people to talk about. Why is that?
Because a lot of people believe that net worth is self-worth. And if you're making minimum wage, or if you're unemployed, right, or you're making less than your colleague, what does that say about you? It shouldn't
because that's how we treat people.
Absolutely, and we say things like money is power. So culturally, we have these sort of ideals around money that aren't necessarily fair.
So if you're in a relationship, at what point do you start talking about money?
Inserting yourself into the conversation is really important because that person on the other end of the table may feel insecure. So starting the conversation with, here's how I did it, or here's what I struggled with, to make it clear that this is going to be a safe place to talk about money.
Well, a lot of people still don't want to. So how does one talk about money, address financial issues with their parents, their colleagues, their friends, their siblings?
If you want to overcome the ickiness of talking about money, don't make it about money at first, right? Talk about where you want to be in the next year or 5 years and why you care about that, and use that as your sort of carrot to get you through some of the harder stuff. And I think it's also important to come to the table without any preconceived notions of how it's going to go, and just to be open and non-judgmental and really make it a listening meeting and go from there and see where that takes you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.